Okay. I was asked to come and talk about my research, and my PhD, this is the title of it. It's called From Memnon to Gangnam, a diachronic study of technology-led abstraction in oral, written, and music-based poetries. You know, phew. But basically, I look at the impact that technologies have had on poetic expression, so things like telegraphy, the gramophone, computing technologies, radio, and how they've changed poetic expression over time, diachronically. That's all it needs. But my sister, who's here, always asks me what my dinner party answer would be to the question, you know, what is your PhD actually about? And it's a little bit glib, but I always say, it would ask the question, why do kids like hip-hop, but you can't get them to read poetry? It seems pretty obvious to me, and I expect everybody else in the room, that there is an enthusiasm for sort of mnemonic, oral forms, that patterned, rhythmic speech excites people. But these forms don't proliferate themselves in the pages of poetry books. They're more televisionally on YouTube, all of those sort of places, and in performance, of course. So, but it's my contention that within these forms that exist outside the literary tradition, that things like visual and sonic symbolism exist, there's mathematical abstraction, things like chance operations, and these are innovations that some of the greatest poetic and musical minds of the 19th and 20th century are responsible for, are sort of conjoined in these forms, and that we shouldn't ignore them. So, let's rewind, maybe 3,000 years to the speaking stones of Memnon. So, it was one of two colossi, the speaking stone of Memnon, and it was built around the middle of the 14th century BC by the pharaoh Amenhotep III. Now, there was an earthquake in 29 BC, and that caused damage to one of the statues. And it's documented in ancient documents that around this time the statue started to speak. So it made this sort of strange, unearthly cry at dawn. Now, there is a possible scientific explanation for that, but I'm not even going to give it to you. The product of this was that people from all over the ancient world came to witness the speaking stone of Memnon, including people like Emperor Adrian, and they literally left their mark on it in the form of 107 inscriptions. Now, bear in mind, you couldn't sort of stand there and have your picture taken in front of the Colossus of Memnon. And this was the technology they used to capture that moment. So they inscribed on it, basically kind of, I was here. Things like this: in the 16th consulate of the Emperor Domitian, Caesar Augustus Germanicus Titus Petronius Secundus, prefect of Egypt, heard the Memnon in the first hour on the day before the Ides of March. But amongst these inscriptions are lines of poetry written in a very ancient form called cento. Now, what is the cento? I think this presents us with an intriguing correlation with hip-hop culture. So a cento is a patchwork poem, and basically it was constructed from lines or half-lines that are lifted verbatim from Homer, typically from Homer and Virgil, but also from Ovid and all sorts of other ancient texts. It's linked with orality in ancient Greece, and they're connected to the tradition of recitation as practiced by the Homeric rhapsodes. And the Homeric rhapsodes were these guys, maybe women as well, I'm not sure, but they memorized the voluminous sort of epic poems of Homer, and they could reconstruct them at will in performance, just in any order, and often created very different narratives than the ones that are established in the original works. These centos are characteristic of the later stages of the respective literary traditions of both Greece and Rome. Now, it was sort of by this point there was so much recorded material in these texts that they just took to sort of refabricating them and reconstructing them, and recontextualizing them to say what they wanted to say. They didn't bother writing any new stuff. They just took these canonical materials and reworked them. So, let's go to modern centenists. So, these days, artists have at their fingertips sort of thousands of millennia of recorded materials with which to fashion new pieces of work. We might have, this drum break or that melody, this line from this poem or that political speech or this image or this sound. And in an essay about the value of the turntable, David Medede says that where a musician's case contains an instrument for sound production, a DJ's case contains information. The hip-hop DJ is a meta-musician, an author, a programmer, and an organizer of recorded fragments, and a builder of databases, whose talents are uniquely suited to survival and meaningful cultural production in our emergent era of total digital cross-reference. Sorry, I'm going to drink a water. So, if we extend it out beyond hip-hop, say, we can see, you could argue that the everyday user of technologies is engaging with cultural data all day, every day. And, within our everyday interactions, we might, work with textual, audio, and visual resources, and we generate these and we collate them and we process them reflexively. And we speak the language of data processing that was once the prerogative of poets and painters. And although we don't all aspire to the production of art per se, our sort of progressive acculturation of this digital dialogue is redefining our notions of what constitutes a text. So my research looks at the sort of history of technologies on poetry. So we'll go back to maybe the second decade of the 20th century and look at Dada's world of manipulable signs. And if we think of the technology that influences this period, we're probably looking at cinema and the gramophone. Now, the cinema and gramophone, what happens in literary tradition, the author sort of retains absolute control of his or her communication, so what stays in or what stays out. But with gramophone and cinema technologies, sort of gather up everything within the scope of their cameras and their microphones. So what we start to get is sort of nonsense intrudes upon sense, the insignificant obtrudes upon the significant, the accidental interposes with the intentional. And the Dada poets, this is in the wake of the First World War, so they draw on this rubble pile of the old order, all these cultural fragments, and they say nonsense is as important as sense. So we have Hugo Ball at the Cabaret Voltaire with his fantastic outfit, and they make sound poems, so Jolly Fanto Bambla or Falle Bambla, or Kurt Schwitters makes eye poems and eye drawings. He cuts the corner off the Hague tram ticket and he says, I am the author of the Hague tram ticket. Raoul Hausmann gets the typesetter to just pick letters at random out of the box and he makes these poster poems. And this all sort of reaches its apotheosis with Marcel Duchamp's Phantom, which is a ready-made, so they introduce chance operations and they say everything is a material to be used in the production of art and poetry, and anybody can make it. So we whiz forward a little bit further and go to the 1960s, participation, pop and performance. So, loosely again, we'll say the technology that has the most sort of cultural clout in the 1960s would be television. And in 1967, the BBC put on a broadcast called Our World, and that was the first ever live satellite, international broadcast. It came from 24 different countries. It joined 500 million people in a shared experience. Nothing like that had ever happened before. And in a section from Toronto, Marshall McLuhan says that the huge mosaic of perspectives that the programme sort of expresses the new participatory nature of modern communication media. So it's the world of participation. We have performance art emerges, cybernetics, it's about the audience becoming part of the anatomy of the work. And the programme famously ends with the Beatles performing All You Need Is Love live from Abbey Road Studios. Now, simultaneously, Philip Larkin is writing poetry, and he wants to make poetry popular. In an essay called The Pleasure Principle, he expresses his wish that a really big talent will come along and make poetry popular again. And he's doing his best, he's writing in these simple strophic forms, your mum and dad, they fuck you up, he's trying to, make it rhyming, making it easy. But he's part of the creative elite, he's from the outside looking in. And I would argue that the Beatles, who are from the inside looking out, talking about the same things, suburban dysfunction, domestic dysfunction, and are a group of 4 young men, and they're almost like an analogue of tribal allegiance, that their audience can participate in. So augmented by electronic sound, I would argue that they are the really big talent that could make poetry popular again. So, let's see if it works. So that humiliating little dance sort of serves to illustrate the point. Why do we love Gangnam? He exists in in the tradition of the popular dance craze, the twist, the jive, the lambada, whatever. But there's something different about this. We're used to seeing sort of chisel-faced boy bands doing perfect routines, and quite frankly, Psy is fantastically not good-looking and not, he's a little bit overweight, and he doesn't give a monkey's. He's absolutely, totally uninhibited, and it's this sort of bravura of performance. It's totally, captivating, but what it does is it makes us all feel we can do it. Well, look, I even had a go. We can participate in the Gangnam style. I would also argue that he's speaking in Korean. I don't know if there's any Korean speakers in the room, but apart from one line, "Hey, sexy ladies," we have no idea what he's saying. It's just total gibberish. So in a way, it's sound poetry. He might as well be Johnny Fantabamla, Hugo Ball at the Cabaret Voltaire. And also, it sort of promotes millions of parodies. So we have, the best one I think was Ai Weiwei with his handcuffs. And what people do is they assimilate a bit of the Gangnam magic into their own contextual frameworks, in the same way as those centaur poets took those lines of Homer and Virgil and repurposed them for their own ends. I don't know if you recognise this, but this is from Fenton. A digital meme that just sort of went global immediately. Does everybody knows Fenton? Fenton the dog?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Sorry, I'm not actually showing the film. So, I would like to talk about sort of mobile technologies and their impact on cultural production and poetics, as it were. I think we could talk for hours as why this entered the imaginative space. It's just funny, basically. But there's also sort of technological signifiers in it. When we watch that little film, the first thing we hear is the wind burn on the built-in microphone on your mobile phone, and we understand that absolutely unconsciously. We hear that, and that tells us also the sort of wobbly orientation of the film and the poor quality of the film, and that tells us something immediately. It says it's spontaneously captured and it's true. Nobody manufactured that. That wasn't an advertiser or a propagandist or anybody trying to manipulate us. That actually happened. Again, I think there's sort of phonetic, textual pleasure in it. The man runs along the street and he runs across the park shouting, "Fenton! Jesus Christ!" And when we hear him say that, it's as if we can see the capital letters. We can see the exclamation marks. It's so apostrophic and angry. Although there isn't a textual representation there, it's as if we can see it. And it's also in a sort of incredibly reduced language. It's 4 words. And that's the 4 word, you know, the sort of language that we communicate in all the time with texts and tweets. And, you know, again, it was sort of cross-pollinated with all sorts of other artifacts from the cultural canon. So we had Fenton versus Bambi, or Fenton versus Jurassic Park, and Fenton versus Downfall. If you're familiar with the Downfall meme, but that's been, you know, reworked with all sorts of different textual reimaginings. So, again, I think, you know, we don't speak German, most of us don't. You do. but and so it's probably not that funny for you, is it? But for us, it's just Hitler going, bash, 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 you know, and he expresses this incredible anger that we all want to express sometimes. And we just patch any old bête noire sort of on it, you know. We say, okay, it's Facebook's user interface, or Fenton, my dog's been naughty, and so again, it's a sort of sound poetry, and there's textual representations, and there's a patchwork of images and sounds and symbolism. Also, with Fenton, I think we associate that image of deer grazing in a royal park with sort of rural tranquility, don't we? It's a classical image, and that's been disrupted by this spontaneous capture. So technologies are influencing all of these things. Just to finish, poets are the hierophants of unapprehended inspiration. Hierophant, I had to look it up. Basically, it's somebody who brings you into the presence of that which is sacred, that which is holy in our experience. And I would argue that there are moments of unapprehended inspiration all around us. And, you know, Shelley tells us that it's the poet's job to reveal those to us. So, to conclude, if we want kids to understand what poetry is, not just kids, anyone, if we want them to understand what it is and why it matters, we shouldn't only deliver it in forms that excite them. We should reveal it to them, the latent poetry, in the things they already enjoy. And that's it. Thank you.